Okay, I should just mention that I have been asked to record this meeting. I've only just pressed record, so we've missed Phil's introduction, I'm afraid, but yeah, okay. So I'm Dave Green. I'm development manager for a co-op called Share Energy. We're based in Shrewsbury, down on the Welsh borders. We've been going for 10 years this year. We've got basically two functions. We've got the development team, which I head up, which helps with feasibility studies such as this, and in developing ideas, bringing forth projects. And then we've got a separate admin team, which looks after sort of community benefit societies and community energy projects once they're up and running. So the admin team would actually run a share offer. It would run the share register. It would do the accounts. It would pay out the interest and capital repayments and all the other bills, help to run AGMs and the rest of it. We've worked on a whole range of projects right across the UK. A bit of solar, a bit of hydro, a bit of wind, a few heat projects. I think we've dealt with over 50 community benefit societies, and I think we're currently signed up to, I think, 6 rural community energy fund projects, and more coming our way as we speak. So Phil's already mentioned the site. Here's the plan of the site, and a couple of photos taken. It's fairly flat, slopes very slightly towards the railway line. It's got trees a copse of trees in the bottom right-hand corner. The access is down Coach Road and along Fox Bank, and then in the bottom here. There's a footpath up the west side. There's a small reservoir lake in the top northwest corner. There's a terrace of houses in the bottom southwest corner. Share Energy as such, we're not energy engineers. So we commissioned James Cooper of Cooper Energy Engineering to do the technical engineering side of it. He had a good look at the site. He made contact with the district network operator, looking into possible connections from the site and whether there was capacity. He also looked at potential direct wire to a large local industrial user. This is the basic plan that he came up with. The final design may well not look like this. This was basically a basic plan to say this is what you could fit on the site, and then he produced some figures out of this for how much electricity we think that proposal could produce, and that's what we've based our figures on so far. So at the moment, all these panels are south facing, and they would look something like this on that basic plan. Reasonably well spaced, otherwise you get shading from low sun from one row of panels to the next. The land in between and underneath the panels can be grazed. It's currently rough grazing. I wouldn't put horses in there or cows. I think it would have to be sheep, but it could still be grazed. This is actually a solar farm in Shropshire that I'm involved in potentially buying. So we look at the south-facing scheme, it will produce around 1.5 million kilowatt hours of electricity a year. So if you allow for the average household energy consumption to be around 3,000 kilowatt hours a year, that would supply around 525 homes. It would save at least 400 tons of CO2, and is the equivalent to, at least in CO2 terms, of at least 1.5 million miles in an average diesel car. Now I say saving at least because carbon accounting is a mixture of an art and a science, basically, and it depends what you compare it to. Generally, people look at the sort of the grid average of electricity, and that's the figure that they would use, that we've used to produce this 400 tons figure. So the grid average carbon factor for electricity at the moment is basically 260 grams per kilowatt hour. But actually, if you're producing energy from a new solar array, you're not replacing the average grid output. You will specifically be replacing, at the moment, gas. And electricity that's produced by gas has a much higher carbon figure, around 400 grams per kilowatt hour. So on that basis, you could argue that you'd be saving a lot more than 400 tons of CO2, but we'll use the basic figure. Now, the other option is to actually go east-west with the panels rather than due south. And that would look more like this. The overall output, the number of kilowatt hours you would get in a year, would be 10 or 15% lower, but you get a much better spread over the day. One of the problems with PV, if it's all south facing, is that you get very little in the morning, you rise to a big peak at midday, and then it drops off fairly quickly again in the afternoon. Whereas if you've got an east-west configuration, your output is higher first thing, it's lower at lunchtime, higher again in the afternoon. And this, while it's giving you less electricity, it might actually be more useful electricity, particularly if you're feeding that electricity into an industrial user, because this peak here at lunchtime, they might not be able to use anyway. So that might have to go out to the grid, whereas they would probably be able to use this extra electricity here on the right and the left. So this is an option that we're seriously considering. It's slightly cheaper to install. You can still have the gaps between the rows. This one, they haven't left gaps between the rows, but you can still do that. But you would normally have the two panels together. So you've got one frame is carrying two rows of panels rather than just one. So this is something that we think is worthy of further exploration. There's also an issue if we were to go for all south-facing panels, then there could be the possibility of some glare issues with the housing that we saw in the southwest corner of the site. Whereas if you have east-west, there's nothing on the east or west side of the site that would complain about the glare. The other option is we do a mix and match. So we do an east-west on the south half of the site where glare would be an issue, and then we put some in the south, some in the north end of the site that's south-facing, so that we get a mix of the two. Now, finance. There is no government support for such a scheme anymore, apart from covering the development costs through the Rural Community Energy Fund, which is very useful in its own right. But in terms of actually building it or operating it, you know, the foundation will be on its own. Up until fairly recently, there was a feed-in tariff, and the feed-in tariff was fairly generous, and that made a lot more things possible, like the wind farms that we can see over Miles's shoulder, that's up on the hill above Oswald Twistle. They were made possible by, you know, a fairly generous feed-in tariff, which has also generated a quite significant community benefit fund that I understand the Prospects Foundation manage. As we haven't got the feed-in tariff anymore, it is important to be able to sell the electricity produced to an organisation that can use a good proportion of the electricity produced through what's known as a direct wire. So it's literally a physical connection. There would be a wire going from the site into a building or a group of buildings, and it would deliver a proportion of their electricity. And then any electricity that they didn't want, if we were generating on a Sunday and the plant was shut, or if we were producing more than they needed at any particular moment, it would then be exported through their meter out into the general grid of the area. We have looked at connecting directly into the grid and selling through the grid, but unfortunately on this scale and this far north, it doesn't work. It doesn't add up. There are solar sites that are being built without subsidy, that are connecting directly to the grid, but they're mostly significantly larger, 10 times as big, if not more, and they're mostly further south. So I think there's one in Dorset that was in the news fairly recently, and I think the City of London have basically done a power purchase agreement with that site in Dorset to buy their electricity through a power purchase agreement, which is, you know, there is no direct wire. It's basically they're buying the electricity that's gone in through the grid. We did, the council, Hyndburn Borough Council, were interested in a PPA, but a power purchase agreement, but it's the prices of power purchase agreements at the moment are simply not high enough to create enough income to make this site stack up. That might change in the future. Electricity prices, wholesale electricity prices, are actually very low at the moment. They've been low for a while and are expected to stay low for a while. It hasn't necessarily been reflected in the price we pay as consumers, but it's wholesale prices that we're interested in if we're generating electricity. So we do have a local industrial company has expressed interest in such a direct wire arrangement, and it looks as though they could use at least 60% of the electricity generated. Now, they've asked not to be named at this point, which is fair enough. We respect their right. So we just have to say it's a local industrial company, but we do have a signed letter of intent from them that would enable us to go on to the next stage of development of the project. We also put in a pre-planning application to Hyndburn Borough Council. They came back with a document that notes that the scheme would help the council and the government with their targets for carbon reduction and renewable energy, and has basically said when you put it in a planning application, what they would expect to see. So it includes ecology and tree reports, and they want to see evidence that we would be improving the biodiversity of the site by around 10%. And they would also be looking for potential noise and glare issues. This is exactly the response we would expect from planning department, unless there was some particular reason why they thought the site was unsuitable. So they haven't said it's unsuitable. They have said that they recognise that it would help them and the government meet targets, but obviously they wouldn't actually pass an opinion on whether it's suitable or not until a full application is made. Now, I don't know how much any of you know about community energy, but the Prospects Foundation are now proposing to set up what's known as a community benefit society to own and run the solar meadow. Now, I understand the Prospects Foundation already runs a CBS, a Community Benefit Society, for the shop. I think it's a slightly different case, but basically the theory is the same. And a community benefit society is a slightly cumbersome term, but it's basically, it's like a co-op, but it's a co-op where the aims of the society are for community benefit rather than to benefit the members. So you can run a workers' co-op or a housing co-op, which has no community benefit aims at all. The co-op would exist for the benefit of the workers or the people occupying the houses. But if you want to set up a community energy co-op, it's got to be done as a community benefit society so that there is some community benefit arising from the action rather than it just being for the sake of the members. So if the scheme goes ahead, then the Prospects Foundation would set up this community benefit society and we would run a share offer. So local residents and others will be able to buy shares in the society, which should earn around 3% interest per annum. Now, I have to say, I'm not going to talk too much about the investment aspect of this. I am not a financial advisor, and we have to be quite careful. And anyone thinking of investing in such a society is advised to get independent advice. But I can tell you the basics. So there are hundreds of such societies across the UK now, including South Hill Solar, Stockport Hydro, and Baywind. Shareholdings are normally, they could be as little as £1 per person. But if you have people who've only got one £1 share, that's a very high administrative burden. So normally the limit, minimum share of 100, maximum legally is 100,000 shares at £1 each. But all shareholders are members of the society with one vote per member. So you get one vote whether you've got £100 worth of shares or £100,000 worth of shares. And there is an asset lock within the society. So basically, the scheme would be protected. It could not be sold to a majority shareholding who would then sell it on to some American corporation. That would not be possible. The shares cannot be traded as such, but they can normally be sold back to the society. So if you have put, a few thousand into this community benefit society, and then suddenly your luck turns, for some reason you need that money back, then you would put in a request to the society to have your capital repaid. It would be up to the board as to whether they did that or not. You wouldn't have an automatic right of getting the capital back, but I'm sure most community energy boards would satisfy that request whenever they could. They would have to have a very good reason for turning such a request down. And one potential way around it is if there isn't money in the bank at that point, they could always ask other members to step in and increase their shareholding so that somebody who needs their money back can get it. Community energy shares generally are considered a long-term investment, and there is obviously some risk involved. Your money is not protected in the way it is, if you've got it in a bank account or other places. Now, there is also the possibility of offering what are known as bonds. These are generally shorter term They generally have a 10-year life with a set repayment plan and interest rate. Now, the society, we've costed this scheme to be around £1.2 million. So if the society is going to raise that, it might well need to do a mixture of bonds and shares. It could also potentially take a loan for some of it as well. So, you know, if Hyndburn Borough Council or somebody else wants to actually do a loan, that's possible as well. Loans generally have higher interest rates and are less flexible than shares. So you don't want your loan to share ratio to be too high. But shorter term bonds, sometimes they enable you to get a bit more money in. If there are people out there who are a bit more risk averse, they want a known plan, they want to put money in for a short period of time, you can do that as well. The idea is that the society will pay rent to the foundation. That will be written into the rules of the society. And because the foundation is a charity, then that would not, those surpluses the rent and the surplus that put over will not be taxed. The idea is that this money will then further the Prospects Foundation environmental projects. However, I have to say that surpluses as such, we normally talk about surpluses rather than profits, but you know, essentially it's the same thing. Surpluses are not expected, however, till the latter years of the project. So initially, the Prospects Foundation will be gaining from the rent and also, you know, from furthering their environmental aims from the carbon savings that are ensuring. And that, as I said previously, in the current situation, we cannot generate large community funds without the feed-in tariff. But having said that, if the scheme goes well, in the latter years of the project, there could still be considerable sums available for the foundation. But we're talking, you know, probably 20 years' time. That is a distinct possibility. It's not guaranteed, but it is a distinct possibility there will be considerable sums available. Yeah, I'll just say as well that Phil and I have been having some discussions about this, about how this would actually work, the relationship between the Community Benefit Society and the foundation. Now, obviously, it will be up to the Community Benefit Society how it manages its finance. The directors of the Community Benefit Society will have to have the freedom to manage their finances. But so it will be up to the board of the society to decide how much of any money that's in the bank at any one point should be spent on capital repayments to its members. And ideally, the society would want to repay that capital as quickly as possible, because capital is expensive. Even at 3%, it's costing you money to hold on to that capital. So if the sooner you can get that capital repaid, the sooner you get your interest payments down, the higher the overall surpluses will be over a sort of 30-year lifespan. But of course, the Prospects Foundation might say, well, actually, that's all very well, but we've got some projects which need funding now, so we'd like some money released earlier rather than paying off and leave some of the capital repayment for latter years. That's perfectly fine. But it will be up to the board of the society to decide whether to do that or not, and they may well decide to refer to the membership at the AGM to verify, you know, what the members say. Generally, we find that members of societies are quite surprised that societies are so keen to give the capital back to them. You know, we've made this big effort to get people to buy shares, and then within a few years we start to say, well, you know, here's 10% of your capital back, and they say, I want to leave it in, thank you very much. but generally it is because, you know, capital costs you money. So so if you can pay it back, generally that's a good thing to do. I would say one other thing is that, you know, if you're raising 1.2 million pounds, then you need a reasonably attractive interest rate. Now, 3% is lower than a lot of schemes that have floated in the last few years with the feed-in tariff, you know, that we're up in 4 or 5%. But without the feed-in tariff, 3% we think is affordable and attractive enough, because, you know, if you've got that money sitting in the bank, it will be earning absolutely nothing. But there is, so if you were raising, say, £100,000, then you might be able to do it only offering 2%. But if you're raising 1.2 million, we think it's got to be somewhere up around 3%. But it would always be possible for people to sign to say that their interest or part of their interest should be paid to the foundation rather than coming to them, so that people would, in fact, they, you know, you could put your money in at 3% or 1.5% or 0 interest, and the interest would then go and benefit the foundation. And if that was approved as a way forward, then people could always change their minds at a latter point. Again, you know, if your circumstances change and you suddenly think, oh, actually I could do with that interest, then you could change and say, no, I want my 3% now. So that's another way that the foundation could benefit more quickly if people are minded to do that. Yeah, so the idea is that the Prospects Foundation will set up this separate community benefit society, and we are now preparing a phase 2 application to the Rural Community Energy Fund. This should take the scheme through development and planning, including finalising an agreement with the company already mentioned to sell the electricity and obtaining detailed quotes for the work. If planning permission is granted and the finances appear favourable, then a share offer could be issued early next year with installation next summer. Can't guarantee that we'll meet that time scale, but that seems reasonable. Yeah. We would particularly like to thank Kate Gilmartin of the Northwest Energy Hub for her support, and to the Rural Community Energy Fund in general for their support in getting the project this far. It's incredibly useful to have the Rural Community Energy Fund to fund feasibility for projects of this nature. And I would note that now the phase 2 is a grant. Previous incarnations of RCEF, phase 2 was a loan, and it was a loan at a hefty interest rate. So, you know, if you took out £100,000 for your phase 2 and the project went ahead, you would have had to pay back £145,000. But if you didn't go ahead, you didn't know anything. So I was actually a director of a community benefit society that was looking into a hydro scheme, and we got phase 2 of previous RCEF funding, but unfortunately it didn't go ahead. So luckily we didn't have to repay that finance. But this time, phase 1 and phase 2 of RCEF are both grants. It's been very useful. Okay, so that's me done. Are there any questions? Mike, are you there? Are you looking at questions?
Hi, yeah, Dave. We haven't got any so far, but if anyone wants to put them on a chat or
there must be some questions. Hold on, I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can get more of you. I know it was a comprehensive presentation, but there must be.
I think Jeff Scales has got a question for us.
It's a question from Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah, and Miles Parkinson has put his hand up as well. So we'll come to Miles next. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it sounds great. I mean, it's definitely, I mean, I'm on for a couple of reasons. I think one, I'm interested in the whole, you know, agenda, and I'm particularly interested in investing in the future, just because I think it's great. And I've seen what the wind turbines have kind of done in terms of, you know, giving back to the community, and a number of projects in Richton have benefited from that. So I suppose it was a couple of questions. Do you sell it? Can I see? Do you see this scheme being, I suppose, productive enough to be able to see kind of any return back to the community in the form of, you know, small grants and that kind of thing, in the same way that the wind turbines have supported local projects? But I suppose it was also about the kind of, I suppose, the difficulty that Prospects is looking at setting this up, but community benefit societies, because it's like one member, one vote, it's then this kind of awkward thing in terms of how they control it. And I know there has been some work done almost about, you know, looking at community benefit societies and having like nomination rights to the board of community benefit societies for kind of named organisations. So you can have like Prospects, you can take a number of board positions and therefore maybe even control it with voting rights alongside a wider kind of membership, which still kind of have a vote. I don't know if any of that's been thought about, sort of locking in Prospects' interest into the community benefit society in the way that it's actually structured.
Yes, that's possible. It's unusual. I think it's already been written into the aims of the Community Benefit Society, or the objects that any surpluses made will be paid specifically to the Prospects Foundation, who can then decide what projects to put it on. Now, I suppose technically it will be possible for the Community Benefit Society to change its aims and objectives, but then you would have to have a majority of the shareholders voting to do that. So I would be loath to you know, it's possible it could be written into the rules to say, you know, that 2 or 3 of the committee should come from the foundation, but personally I don't see a great need for that. The way a community benefit society works is that you have an initial group, the founder members who set it up, because obviously when it starts work, it doesn't have a project, doesn't have any shares, so it doesn't actually have members. But you have a group of founder members who effectively form the initial board of the project and get it through the initial share offer. Then you would have an annual general meeting sometime in the first year, and those founding directors would stand aside and a new board would be elected. Now, it's up to the founding directors. They can obviously stand again, but they wouldn't automatically carry on, because then, you know, the control over who's on the board is then in the hands of the members of the society. And I think that's the best. Once you start having nominated rights, and, you know, especially if, you know, you were saying there was five people on the board and 3 of them have got to be from the foundation, then the members might be saying, well, you know, we own this, but we don't have control of it. So yeah. As to the community benefit funds, yeah, I mean that is difficult to say. I mean, there are a lot of variables governing the finances of a scheme like this. So, you know, obviously before we go ahead, we'll have a pretty good idea of the price. We'll have a pretty good idea of what the company is prepared to pay for the electricity. We'll have a pretty good idea of what we can get for export. We'll have a pretty good idea of what the ongoing costs are likely to be. but even then, until it's built, we won't know exactly what the output of it is each year. We won't know exactly how much of that electricity the company are using. And then, of course, after that, it's things like inflation that really start to take over as sort of governing factors. You know, high or low inflation can make quite a big difference to the way the scheme works. So our model is assuming, you know, a reasonable output, a reasonable cost, reasonable inflation, and we get to a point where we think there won't be any major surpluses to hand out within 20 years. But it might go much more favorably than that, and money might well be available before then. But of course, if you've done this 20 years seems like a long time. It doesn't seem as long to me now as it used to, I have to say. But you know, they always say, you know, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time? Now. You know, so obviously, if the Prospects Foundation had done this 20 years ago, that money would now be flowing. So I'm sure the foundation will be very appreciative in 20 years' time if this goes ahead and works out as we envisage.
Can I just add something at that point, Dave?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a Prospects initiated project, and it will be Prospects that will be writing the basic constitution of the Community Benefit Society, and in there will be a surpluses use policy, which will name Prospects as one of the beneficiaries, perhaps the primary beneficiary. But of course, the Benefit Society is independent of the charity, and the directors of the Benefit Society have to make their decisions in the best interests of the society. That's a legal requirement. But we would hope that it would be respected, the fact that this has all been brought about but through Prospects initiative, and that everything that the Prospects would do with any income from the society would be used for the good of the local community and for the good of the local environment. So that's how we see it. We can't control the Benefit Society, but we would hope that its aims would, you know, continue into the future.
I think Miles had a question next.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Dave. Mine's just quite a few, really. The question of the direct wire, how far that can go and not lose the electricity. And the reason I asked that is that the council is looking at all its small fleet of vehicles to be all electric, and I'm looking at the leases to be all tied up by next April. And if that is done, then of course there's the usual charging points, but we'd also be looking at solar panels, whether they were carports or whatever. But if this was where it is, we have one compound, which is the major refuge depot, and eventually we will be looking at all electric refuge wagons, but they're far too expensive at this time. But we're starting off with the small vehicles and then eventually getting to the bin wagons, even though we've done work on them by having electric lifts and etc. So I'm just wondering whether the direct line from that location, and Phil Barwood may have knowledge where the CBMU unit is, and I don't know where your other business is, whether that's roughly by the, shall we say, the chemical plant, and whether we could get it over the canal or get it to our site, and whether that's something which would work for both the council and you, because then we wouldn't be, because we won't have the same space at CBMU for solar panels, for the carports and everything. So I'm just wondering about the direct wire. How far can that go?
Well, it's not a question of how much electricity you lose, particularly. It's more a question of cost, you know, especially if you're digging up pavements and all the rest of it, taking it through a town, going over roads. That tends to add up in cost. So, you know, we could certainly look at that within the phase 2. It's perfectly possible to to deliver electricity to more than one point. The easiest way of doing it, though, is actually, if you like, divide up the array. So, you know, a quarter of it goes off to one site and 3/4 of it goes off to another. So you do lose a bit of flexibility there. So we'd have to be, I think the society would want to know that, you know, they weren't losing out because they were now supplying the council, but it could certainly be investigated. We did look at, you know, the first thing was, you know, could there be EV charging points directly attached to the solar farm? But it really does not seem to be a site that lends itself to that. You know, we don't want to be encouraging people to drive down Coach Road and Fox Hill Bank just to park up for half an hour and charge their car. You know, but certainly that would be something worth looking at. I was in a very interesting seminar the other day, actually, about electric refuse trucks and how popular they are with the staff who use them, and how they actually work better than diesel trucks. Because diesel refuse trucks have a horrendous performance. It's something like 3 miles a gallon. And you've also got air quality issues associated with that as well. Apparently, electric refuse trucks are actually, they pull away better. They've got more pulling power than the diesel ones. And the staff, where they've had them, the staff love them. One council has actually done it by having a site with anaerobic digestion from their food waste. And so they're, rather than taking the refuse trucks back to their normal depot overnight, they take them to the AD site and they plug them in using electricity generated by the food waste that the trucks have been collecting during the day. So that, you know, that there's certainly some interesting things there to look out for.
Just very quickly, and a supplementary, sorry about this.
That's all right.
There is an option, because like you said, it is about cost and the direct wire, and no one wants to be digging up pavements and roads.
Yes.
Looking at where you are, you would have to come up Coach House Road and then probably cross the road, and then we've got the Leeds Liverpool Canal. If there could be a partnership with the Canal and Rivers Trust, we could do it, you know, lay it along the canal towpath, because actually the CVMU work there, so it's not going all the way around church to the actual site. So if you are doing a cost analysis, the other issue is that the east to west seems to be preferable, because I mean, of course, you'd have staff who are using it for their own electric vehicles going to the site, you would hope, and the government will purchase that. But by having the early morning and the late evening would be good for the actual works vehicles to be charged. So it's just, if you are looking at, because you were saying was 40%, I don't know what that equates to, whether that would be enough for vehicles or charging. It's just putting it out there, because the council will be going all electric.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd say is it's not a constant 40%.
Yes.
You know, there are times when the plant could use 100%. And there's other times when it would only use 20%. So, you know, that's what I say. If you lose some flexibility, then that doesn't mean to say that we're directing all the 40% to somewhere else. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work like that. But of course, actually, the lower amount we're delivering, the higher the proportion of that should be used by the industrial company.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if I keep coming back. I mean, the issue there is, I mean, with the electric vehicles, we'll have charging points that'll just come off the normal electric.
Yeah.
But we will want to substitute that with solar panels. So you know, it's just the aspect, we will be doing it. And if there is an option between the council and yourselves, then it's probably something that officers can talk about.
But I mean, I think the other thing which we haven't talked about much, but is a possibility, is that once you've got an established community benefit society in Church and Oswald Thistle, you know, that would be a great vehicle for going ahead and doing further projects. You know, this is a nice site, a nice project, but why stop there? You know, yeah, that would certainly be of interest.
We've got a question from Karen about the life expectancy of the panels.
Yeah, that's a good question, Karen. We used to say 25 years people are now saying 30 years plus. They're really not degrading as quickly as people expected them to back, 10, 20 years ago. Of course, the vast majority of solar panels in the world have been fitted in the last 10 years. You go back 10 years ago and before the feed-in tariff, and it was very rare to see solar panels anywhere. In fact, I was reading a report, it's a bit of a sideline, but I was reading a report about Worcestershire, written in 2008, and it was talking about all the wonderful things they could do for renewable energy and how much they should have by 2026. And they said 80 megawatts. 80 megawatts would be our top level by 2026. That would be brilliant. But how are they going to do it? Wind and biomass. There is no mention of PV in that document at all. And now in Worcestershire, there is somewhere around 100 megawatts of renewable energy, and it's virtually all PV. So, things have moved on hugely. And, similar, wind goes back a bit further. Wind was coming in before, back, it would have been the late 90s, wasn't it? When under Thatcher, when they privatized the electricity industry, they brought in the renewable obligation certificate then, and wind was in a position then to take off. But solar has really got going in the last 10 years. But we're certainly looking at 30 plus years. We've modeled it on 30 years. That's comfortable. If you can keep it going for 35 years, then obviously there will be considerable extra benefit in those last few years.
So there were a couple of questions about biodiversity, I think, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to say we've got a couple there's one from Joan and one from Penny or Stephen about the biodiversity on the site and how we would propose to increase it and what it's likely to be.
Very good question. No idea.
I'll deal with that.
It's something that we haven't. There are various ways of increasing biodiversity. I mean, at the moment, it's grass basically. So if you can get some sort of flowering shrubs in, plant a hedge line around the fence line with some flowering shrubs that are attractive to bees and butterflies, that would automatically be a huge boost to the biodiversity of the site. As I say, the actual grassland itself is unaffected. It's not like we're building a factory on the site, and in fact, the grass often slows down in the summer because it gets too hot. Whereas you've got a cooling effect of the shade of the panels, means actually you can get as much growth under there. But there's lots of potential then for looking at well, what do we do with that grass mix? Do we then put in more flowering clovers and all sorts in with the grass to improve the biodiversity? There's always the possibility of bringing in some beehives. Lots of opportunities, but the idea is that we will look at that. We will have to look at that as part of the phase 2 application. Because that's part of the planning. They've made it clear. The planners have made it clear that they will be expecting a biodiversity boost.
So
one thing I would say is that I would hope that the foundation would take that seriously. I believe they would. I've been involved in other sites where written in the planning permission, there's all sorts of good things, but they haven't happened, and nobody's stopped them. So one thing is that you should the fence should have a gap at the bottom, at least not necessarily all the way around, but there should be, so that hedgehogs and other small mammals can come and go freely. They're often left out. If you plant a hedge around the site, then you should go back every year or two and replace any of the plants that have died. There's lots we can do, and I think it would be a good project for the foundation in its own right.
Well, we've called it a solar meadow for good reason, because the majority of the site is grassland, and there will be opportunities to develop wildflower meadow around and beneath and between the panels. So that's one opportunity. The other thing is there are 4 parts of the site that would not be directly affected by the panels, such as the woodland in the southeast corner, the pond in the northwest corner, where there is known amphibian benefit. There's a hedgerow down the western side against the footpath, which could be managed to much greater biodiversity benefit. And there's a steep slope facing onto Coach Road, which where you can't put panels.
Yeah.
So in all 4 of those areas, we would be managing better for the benefit of wildlife and biodiversity habitat, as well as the wildflower meadow within the central part of the site itself, in and around the panels.
Yeah.
So I think anybody who's familiar with prospects will know that biodiversity is one of our principal concerns, and I would say that to date most of our activity has been about biodiversity. Energy is in our aims, but a project of this size for energy is a new thing for us. Most of our concern to date has been about biodiversity. So it is something that we'll be taking very seriously, and we will be required to submit those details with the planning application and prove to the satisfaction of the council that we will be undertaking those management methods.
Yeah. And of course, the scheme, you know, the maintenance of the site will be an appropriate cost to the installation. So that biodiversity work will have some funding attached to it. So it's, you know, which should be greatly helpful.
Just got another one, and then I know Lorraine's got a hand up. So the next one was about the families living near the meadow, about how they feel about the project. And then Lorraine's got one after that, really.
Shall I answer that, Dave?
Yeah, have you had any feedback or contact with the residents?
No, the residents on Hill Street, Foxhill Bank House and Foxhill Bank Lodge were directly consulted by letter and invited to this meeting. But unless I'm mistaken, I don't think any of them have attended.
Lorraine's here, yeah.
Pardon?
Lorraine.
With a hand up.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Hello. So we're very conscious of being so close to our neighbours, and I believe that to date Prospects has had a pretty good relationship with the residents of Hill Street, and they will be directly consulted at the planning application stage, obviously, because they are the most directly affected people by the development. We'll do everything we can to accommodate, you know, to protect their amenity and take on board their comments. I think one of the consequences of that might be that depending on the orientation that Dave was talking about previously, whether they're southward facing or east-west, one of the consequences could be to set back a couple of rows from the boundary at the back of the houses on Hill Street, so that both the visual impact and any glare is reduced. And then it gives an opportunity, provides a space where perhaps some screen planting can be put in to soften the visual impact. That's the sort of thing that we can talk about.
Good, thank you, Phil. Is Lorraine next?
Thank you. Hello. Actually, just leading on from what you just said, Phil, you mentioned then the back of the houses on Hill Street, but it's actually the front of the houses. They face the
Yes.
directly against the boundary. So that would be I think even more pertinent that would be considered. Can I just ask one simple question? What's the height of the individual units? I can see from the photos that you showed, but it's often quite deceptive looking from a sort of aerial view. How high do they stand, and how close would the closest panel potentially be to the fronts of Hill Street properties?
Yeah, we wouldn't be looking on some solar farms. You see quite big racks, you know, with 3 or 4 panels stacked on top of each other, going up to sort of 2.5 meters. That was not thought suitable for the site. So we'd be looking at, you know, 1.5, 1.8 meters, 5 or 6 foot for the top of the rows, I suspect. And if anything, the east-west, you tend to put them at a slightly lower angle, so they would be lower still. We haven't gone into any great detail, but I think Phil's idea of a sort of planting bank in that southwest corner to separate the nearest roads from those houses would be a very good idea. Obviously, we don't want to sacrifice too much land, because we don't want to bring the output down too far, because a lot of the costs will be fixed, you know.
Yeah.
The cost of the fencing, the cost of the connections, and all the rest of it are going to be the same. So we don't want to give too much away, if you like, but there is certainly room for some play to make some areas screening and take them away from the house. And I certainly think at least the panels that are nearest the houses really ought to be east-west facing, so that they are less visually intrusive to the residents of those houses.
That leads me on to just asking about what stage are for Phil really, what stage are the plans or the potential plans at, and are they available for viewing, your costings and things like that?
There is, I mean, we have a slight issue that the company we hope to supply to has asked not to be named. So the full report that we've prepared for the foundation and for RCEF names that company. It has to, because they've signed a letter of intent. So the intention is not to release the full report, I'm afraid. I would always want to release as much information as possible, but we have specifically written an executive summary and a conclusion, a sort of case study statement that that does not mention the company. On the basis that they can, those two statements can be made public without revealing the name of the company. And it will then be up to, you know, the Prospects Foundation have got some of the figures. Their trustees will be talking about it. Obviously, the board will be talking about it.
And have that company requested it or put any conditions to their involvement, like a tie-in period or a walk-away period? Are there any, have they put any very, very stringent conditions in place to actually commit themselves to potential involvement?
No, they've put no commitment, no conditions in at all. And neither have we at this stage. They are, I have to say, they were very interested, and they would be doing it not to save money particularly, because they don't think they will save much money, but they will be doing it because they think it's a good thing to do. So that's a good position to be in. We were pleased by how interested and supportive they were. Now, I don't know whether it was you, but I think somebody else has put in a written question about what happens if that company disappears or changes their mind. Now, obviously, this I've already emphasised that we need a direct wire to make this scheme really viable, to repay the capital in a reasonable period that gives some wriggle room, so that if things don't work out quite as planned, you can still pay off the capital within the 30-year life. Now, if the company were to pull out, I've worked it out basically around 18 years. If they were to pull out sooner than that, then basically the society would have to find a similar arrangement somewhere else, unless unless we got to a point where electricity prices has risen so high that actually at that point, then just an arrangement, a power purchase agreement with the council through the grid might be enough. But it's at that sort of level. So if it happens before, if it happens after then obviously you lose some of the surpluses, but you can still repay the capital and continue paying the interest. If it happens before then you would struggle to do it without making an alternative arrangement. But we're not in the middle of the country here. This is quite an advantageous site from that point of view, that there are alternatives. I mean, there is the leisure centre not so far away. There is the council facility that we've already talked about. There are other industrial plants. So, I was talking to group who've got a mill, and they've got a hydro scheme that's attached basically to the paper mill next door, and they're really worried if that paper mill was ever to close down, because there's nothing else around them. They're just in the middle of nowhere. But so here, yes, if on the basis of our figures, if the company were to pull out within 18 years, then an alternative arrangement would definitely be needed. And obviously that is a risk factor that would have to be written into the share offer, and everybody would have to be aware of before they invested their money in the scheme.
So can I just add two things though? One is, if things of that nature are going to emerge, they will occur during the negotiation in the next stage of the development of the project.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be some hard-nosed discussion. And the second thing is that risk is inherent in any 30-year plus commercial project. So all we can do is to ensure that as much of it is pinned down in the agreement as possible, but nothing can be guaranteed. I suppose that's fair to say, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah. And the finances are not, they're not wonderfully rosy, and they're not what we're used to with the community energy, but they're certainly no worse than any other community energy scheme that we've been looking at. And as I say, I think there are factors there that can mitigate against the risk being in such an urban location. So yeah, and we're in a luxurious position. If we were commercial developers, we would have to put our own money into the next phase, whereas we are in the luxurious position of, potentially, they haven't given it to us yet, but hopefully the Rural Community Energy Fund will supply funding for the next phase. Now, obviously, we would all like for the scheme to come to fruition, but we have to be realistic. And if we get towards the end of that phase 2 work and it isn't working, then we have to be prepared to say, well, unfortunately, this is, this now appears too risky. The costs are higher than we thought. The company is not prepared to pay as much, or then it now appears they're not going to use as much, or whatever. There is the possibility that in 6 months' time, 9 months' time, the society will have to close the scheme down in effect. But I think there's a good chance. There is a good chance that it can go through, and that we can bring it to fruition.
I think we've got a comment from Anne about the Hymenburn Butterfly Group. Might be interested. Yeah, they have done a lot of projects with prospects in the past, so I think we'll be definitely working with them. And then Kimberly's got a question. Do you want to read your question out, Kimberly? It's quite a long one.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to know what feedback you'd had from the district network operator regarding the project, and whether I did put in saying I noticed Kate was on the call, and whether as part of the Northwest Energy Hub and the Transforming Communities project that Electricity Northwest do, if that's something that you've thought about joining up with, or seeing how they could help with the scheme.
Yeah, we did contact the district network operator. They and at that point we were looking at, well, we had to cover the possibility of connecting directly into the grid. They said that there was capacity in the local grid. They did not have an issue with that, which again is a luxurious position. There's an awful lot of areas of the country where the grid is so constrained now by renewable energy that you can't get grid permission. They were happy. There was a cost for connecting directly to the grid. It wasn't outlandish. We could probably have got it negotiated down. The reason we're not going that way is because the price we get through a power purchase agreement simply wouldn't be high enough at this point. So that's why we need to go through an industrial user, and that they were perfectly happy for that. I think it's quite useful that we've got, that there's a lot of renewable energy around, but it's up on the hills and it's wind. It's areas where there's a lot of solar already. The DNOs are now starting to turn down solar schemes in areas where they've already got, what they see as too much solar. And certainly Herefordshire, Worcestershire, it's very difficult to get permission from the district network operator for a solar scheme. And of course, the wind now is heavily constrained by planning constraints. So yeah. And Kate, do you want to answer?
Sorry, I actually meant, rather than the connection, tapping into the Transforming Communities Fund.
Yeah, I was going to pass over to Kate to answer that part.
Yeah, hi Kimberly. Yes, I'm in touch with Helen Seagrave at the Community Connects, and I've been working really closely with her, because when anybody comes to me about a potential project, the first thing I do, as for the reasons Dave just mentioned, is drop Electricity Northwest an email and tell me what your grid's like, because otherwise there's no point wasting time looking at a project that's never going to happen, because they'll say, sorry, there's no capacity on the grid. So yeah, working closely with Helen, and actually we're putting on a series of events this year, starting, I think it's the 26th of March, we've got one, to trying to encourage community groups and people interested in this kind of project, community projects. So I'll certainly send details to Phil at Prospects, and hopefully he can share with people who are on the call. It might be of interest for you if you're looking at any other projects or got any ideas. So yeah, thanks, Kimberly.
Thanks.
Lorraine, you've still got a hand up. Is that relevant? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, just another one for Phil on the costings. Have you allowed a substantial amount for security, just being where we are? What, and Dave as well, I assume that they are that those panels are commodities that have a value to somebody who may steal them. So is that built in as well?
Yes, security has been acknowledged as an issue. I mean, it is an issue with solar farms, full stop. So it's something that would need to be addressed. It would need to be sturdy fencing. There would need to be CCTV, and it would need to be, actually looked at rather than just going to a blank box somewhere. Those are obviously, additional costs, and they're one of the reasons why, why the scheme doesn't look quite as wonderful financially as it might do otherwise. But yes, but actually, you know, it's relatively low compared to the cost of the panels and the transformers and getting the connection in. You've got to put some sort of fencing around it anyway. Every solar farm has a fence around it. So you've just got to put it into a slightly higher standard and then make sure that it is actually watched, you know. And
so what is the setup period of time? So assuming that the nod comes and plans are put in motion, how long does the actual setup of the entire, from going in on the site to having a working site, take?
That's a very good question. I think it partly depends on the layout of the east-west. I think is a much easier system to construct. But I certainly imagine in this situation that we'd be putting the fence up first.
Okay.
And then delivering materials inside the fence, and then probably, you know, maybe not bringing all the panels and all the wiring and everything in on day one, and then.
So what's your average? Would you on an average site with an average access, etc., would you be talking about months, weeks, years?
No, I would expect a month would do it.
Okay.
It's obviously weather dependent, and you know, but
okay.
And
one other one directly
to
Phil again. Sorry, again from the resident side of things. Your previous plans, which you had on the site, allowed for reinstatement of the road for the full length of Coach Road and Foxhill Bank Brow, right up around Hill Street, back down again. I'm assuming from what I heard just mentioned a little earlier that isn't the case on this plan, and what, you know, what would be proposed.
I mean, unfortunately, you know, back to the finances, there simply isn't the finance available for, you know, doing major road upgrades and gain access to the site. We understand that the objections to previous plans were on the basis of ongoing usage.
Yes.
You know, that there would be, you know, lorries coming in and out on a daily basis, and that the site was used recently, I think, by Network Rail to.
I don't think that's the case, actually. I think you say lorries in and out, but the previous plan had an entrance closer to the railway bridge at the Blackburn Road end of Coach Road, as well as a separate entrance. Is that right, Phil? Facing my gates at Foxhill Bank House.
In the planning permission, we would have been required to improve Coach Road to an adoptable standard as an industrial access, and that's quite a high standard of improvement. Which was the very thing that rendered the development not viable because of the cost of very, very large amounts of money. So that was on the basis of it being an industrial use, so vehicle usage.
But was the industrial not to the bottom end, and then you had some residential at four eco houses at the top end?
The 4 eco houses is still a proposal that we will be pursuing separately, and at the southern end of the site, nearest to Foxhill Bank House, in fact, sort of in the locality of Hill Street. We would be allowed up to 4 houses without being required to improve the road to an adoptable standard.
Right.
So, because the frequency and nature of the vehicles visiting the site as a photovoltaic array are very much less than a business park. It remains to be seen because we haven't yet made a planning application, but it's extremely unlikely, I think, that we'll be required to improve the road to an adoptable standard, because our usage of the road will be hardly any. Once the construction has taken place, our only usage of the road will be for periodic maintenance inspections and jobs that have to be done on the site. So there'll be the occasional vehicle coming and going. If we go ahead with the 4 houses proposal, that'll be the subject of a separate application, and again, it wouldn't be a huge increase in the usage of Coach Road.
Okay, are you suggesting that those 2 plans could go ahead alongside each other, or is it one or the other, or one is secondary to the other?
Alongside each other.
Okay.
Yeah,
so both plans would go in at the same time?
No, I think we want to get this the photovoltaic scheme sorted first, and then we'll come to the houses at a later date.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that will be the subject of the whole separate process and separate consultation with residents, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody has asked about who the audience for the share issue would be. Well, I mean, it's certainly something that you could make a big noise about locally, but you know, we find that the schemes that we're doing share offers for, we get people signing up from all over the country, and you know, why would you turn somebody away just because they happen to live in Orkney, or you know, or they live in Kent and haven't got a local scheme of their own? And in fact, I own shares in a number of small community benefit societies that are scattered across the country with a sort of range of technologies and different places, just because that's the way I like to do it. So and we've had very little problem getting share issues signed up for recently, and the number of schemes, you know, we're still just getting the last few that have got the feed-in tariff, that have managed to pre-accredit for the feed-in tariff and have come through. I know that Egni in Wales have recently raised £2 million. Bristol Energy Co-op have raised over £1 million. Congleton Hydro raised about 700,000. Reading Hydro, I think, have raised nearer £1 million. You know, these are not unusual sizes for share offers. As I say, there would always be the option that it doesn't all have to be shares. The scheme wouldn't need to fall if you didn't raise 1.2 million from shares, but that's the preferred route. Then you can think about bonds, and you can have a backup loan available if you need it. And a very good question from Anne. No, sorry, I don't know anybody. It's Anne Hurricane, not Anne Pink. Anne was asking about the government bringing back incentives. I think that the thing is that the feed-in tariff did the job that it was designed to do. It has greatly increased the amount of renewable energy in this country, and it has brought the price of renewable energy down substantially. I think so. The grid is decarbonising fairly rapidly, and as I said, I mentioned a figure earlier of 260 grams per kilowatt hour. Now, I've been in energy advice for 15, 16 years. When I started out, it was 500 grams a kilowatt hour. I discovered fairly recently in the 1970s, it was a whole kilo. Every kilowatt hour that we consumed, you know, 1 bar of an electric fire on for an hour produced a whole kilo of CO2. Now we're down to 260 grams and it's still falling. So mind of government basically is that issue is being dealt with. What they need to do now is look at planning issues so that we can have some more onshore wind, and they need to make sure that the grid issues are sorted so that schemes like this aren't constrained by grid capacity, which is often the case. If they're going to put any money into anything, it's much more likely to go into heat schemes, because the decarbonisation of heat is much further behind the decarbonisation of our electricity supply, and that's the next big challenge. So yeah, that's where I expect future funds to go, really, rather than coming back to. And I might be wrong. They might suddenly bung some money into PV or wind, but I wouldn't bank on it. Are there any more questions you picked up, Mike, or anyone else?
No, there's nothing on the chat, so unless anyone's got one you want to raise there.
It's just coming up to 9 o'clock. We've been going an hour and a half, so I think that's probably enough, isn't it, Phil?
Yep, I think so. Yep.
Yeah, well, thank you all for attending and for your interest and for your interesting questions. And yeah, as I say, we will now be finalising the report to the Rural Community Energy Fund and putting in an application for phase 2 funding. So I look forward to working with you further later in the year.
Right, thanks everyone, and watch this space.
Yeah, bye all and stay safe.
Yep, cheerio.